Thank you very much. And it's a real pleasure for me to join you all for this really wonderful conference. It's a great programme, and it's really, really fun to collaborate with you all again. And so I hope that my paper is a valuable contribution. So the title of my paper is looking at the pathways to sustainable value, but I'm looking at it through the lens of the European Union's sustainable finance framework. And I'm asking the question if we are actually dancing with the devil here. And I'm being provocative, but I also think that this is a really quite a serious question, and I'll explain why through this paper. It is very much a work in progress, so I will be very happy to receive your comments and thoughts, and to tell me if you think I'm completely wrong about what I'm suggesting.
Dear Charlotte, sorry to interrupt you, but could you put it on a presentation mode?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
That is, I think, that's great. Thank you. Right.
Okay. Thank you. So the basic argument that I will be making is that whilst it is very important that we seek private money or private funds to help to pay for the transition towards sustainable a sustainable economy, that's obviously a really important thing. And the Sustainable Finance Action Plan is a really important part of this process. And I think that it has some very positive things as part of the programme, which are firstly to embed sustainability considerations into the financial decision-making process. And it also puts sustainability reporting more on an equal level with financial reporting. So that, I think, is a really important contribution being made by this Sustainable Finance Plan. But I think it is quite limited. I think it really is just little more than a nudge that is kind of asking the finance actors to do the right thing, but it's not necessarily telling them or compelling them to do the right things. And I also think that it's not strong enough insofar as it does very little to question the regime of accumulation in which the finance actors have always operated. And I'll explain that as we go on. And the final part of the argument is that we require a kind of mechanism that will enable all stakeholders and communities to participate more fully in the shaping of the regulatory framework, because this all centres on what we value and how we value. And I think that that's kind of feels a little bit missing from the conversation around the Sustainable Finance Action Plan. So the paper's going to be structured in 4 key parts. The first part will describe the role that company law structures have played so far in the story around, if you like, corporate extraction, and what that means for our attempts to shift towards a more sustainable economy. The second part then provides an overview of the European Union's efforts. And then in part 3, I offer a critical analysis of the European Union's Green Deal and its Sustainable Finance Action Plan. And finally, I offer some suggestions, which are rather tentative, but nevertheless, they are suggestions for some structural changes. So just to kind of give us a little bit of background, and I won't spend long on this because we're all familiar with it, but, you know, the position that we are all in right now is very much a situation of crisis, and important bodies have made this point very clear, not least the United Nations, but also the IPCC has come out with numerous reports telling us that, you know, we need to change our ways quite rapidly. And of course, only recently we saw the important report brought out by the Stockholm Resilience Centre, telling us that we've now broken 6 of the planetary boundaries for safe operating. So this is now a really serious situation. Well, what is the cause of this? Well, some of the papers yesterday touched on this, and Hannah's reference to the word Anthropocene was quite important, because that Anthropocene notion is letting us know that we are in an age in which human activity is dominating what happens to the planet's own natural changes. And those human activities have been very destructive, but the main players in those human activities are very much large corporations. And we know that the corporations are very much the key polluters and the key extractors of natural resources. And numerous writers have told us that corporations are the principal agents of greenhouse gas emissions. And here's just a few very important examples, but they are just a tiny handful of a whole range of examples that we could be using. So why is it that corporations have been allowed to be so destructive and to, deplete the planet's natural resources so easily? Well, I was a member of a previous project before the SMART project. I took part with Jukka and others here in the project that looked at the problems of company law and the obstacles, as well as some opportunities that the company laws across the world would present for sustainability. And that highlighted a number of problems for us. And across the globe, the cornerstone principles of corporate law, we all know, are separate legal personality and limited liability for the shareholders. And those principles have played a very key role in allowing some of the actors within the corporations to be able to act in ways where they will not be asked to account very strongly to other people who are affected by their actions. If you like, it's the externalities of corporate behaviour that we struggle to hold to account for. And corporate structure also typically separates the managers and the shareholders. And that has led to a whole corporate governance approach in which the shareholders have gained the priority around the efforts that we ask the managers to make. In other words, we're told that the managers should become accountable to the shareholders. And for a long time, the other stakeholders have struggled to get some attention from the decision makers in the company law arena. And we also see in company law a hierarchical structure in which the boardroom decides on issues of business strategy, and that boardroom becomes accountable to the shareholders in general meetings. But the other stakeholders are kind of left outside the central room where those decisions take place. Furthermore, under company laws across the globe, separate legal personality gives to the company an autonomous legal status, and that in itself provides a protective barrier from legal responsibility for its members and for other companies within a corporate group, what we call the veil of incorporation. And that is a protective veil for usually the shareholders or for the parent company in a group situation when things go wrong. And so those people that are protected, they have a very limited form of liability. And corporate groups and global supply chain structures make attribution of liability even more difficult. And within that whole corporate law arena, what we've seen come through very strongly is the dominance of shareholder primacy. Many corporate law scholars argue with this dominance of the shareholders, and there's been, a strong push to suggest that shareholder primacy is really a mythical thing. The shareholders are not the owners of the company, and yet there has been this corporate law myth that has grown up to suggest that the shareholders as owners should gain priority when it comes to the decisions being made. And that kind of approach, that attitude, has been endorsed by important international organisations, including the Organisation for Economic Cooperation and Development, the OECD, as well as the IMF and the World Bank and other organisations too. And so in company law, that has often led to the interpretation of directors' duties being that whilst strictly they owe their duties to the company as a separate legal person, in practice, they are required to act for the benefit of the shareholders. And that has again led to the shareholders taking full priority. And yet this is an enduring myth, but it still remains central to the decision-making of the directors. Alongside that shareholder primacy myth, we've also seen another important phenomenon growing in the corporate law arena, and that is the phenomenon of financialization. In the UK, for example, what we've seen is profits being made not through manufacturing and a production of material things, but more over time, we've seen an emphasis on profits being sought through financial channels, financial arrangements, for example, through investments in the shares that are offered by companies. And we've seen a whole industry of financial operators all working to gain lots of money, but it's not through manufacturing processes or other forms of production or provision of services, such as to ordinary people on the street, like we might see hotel and hospitality services, for example. This is just a pure area of financial activity. But that financial activity, that emphasis on finance, has given way or given rise to a simplistic conception of corporate governance. And so we see corporate governance as an agency problem. And it becomes a straightforward question of investor protection. And that became a really strong phenomenon throughout the 1980s and the 1990s, where the whole liberal order began to welcome finance and money market innovations. And through that process, the shares of large corporations became increasingly concentrated in the hands of institutions. And so the control rights attached to those shares actually became a source of considerable power. Now, in basic company law theory, we look at the shareholders as though they need some kind of protection, certainly as individuals, because as individuals and dispersed shareholders, they have very little power. But this financialization process has had the effect of accumulating shareholders together. And so as a united group, or in sort of small sets of institutions holding large numbers of shares, they actually gain a lot of power. And we've seen furthermore a growth of investor chains, where we've got people holding shares on behalf of others. And that has led to a number of rather awkward consequences. Those investor chains have led to very, very unwieldy corporate structural arrangements that are difficult to navigate. It's led to a form of disconnected capitalism, where those who are benefiting from the shares, like dividends and profits, have no real interest in the actual things that the companies are affecting. So they don't really have an interest in the material assets as such. Is all they're looking for is the profits. But meanwhile, those corporate activities that lead to the profits do affect other parts of the world, including the environment. And so we see this disconnected form. Those who are benefiting from the profits are not touched really by the impact of what the corporate actors are doing. And that leads to externalities, not just corporate externalities, but also financialization itself has externalities. We see, through the growth of financial investment arrangements, that leads to higher consumption levels. It leads to further manufacturing and production by companies, but not necessarily in the countries where the financialization is taking place. But that doesn't stop the extraction of resources in other parts of the world. And we see furthermore that the oil and gas industries often benefit from this world of financialization. And it has also led to huge global inequalities and ecological destruction. There's furthermore a real issue around the complexities of finance. And that kind of was part of the conversation with Hannah yesterday, that, we can talk about complexity in different ways. And I think this is one of the areas where complexity is actually a problem. And we've also seen lots of evidence of greenwashing of what we call dirty funds, as well as virtue signalling by some of the asset managers who say, oh, we're only really putting our money into good products or good things, but they don't necessarily look far enough into how those good things or good products are really being made. And recently we've seen some consternation around the Apple company's own virtual signalling with its recent advertisement using Mother Nature as something to say that they're doing good things. And furthermore, under financialization, accumulation, i.e. the gaining of profit, becomes the key motivation. And I think this is where our real problem arises. Disclosure laws have been the main way of holding corporations and capital to account. And what we've seen over time, over a long period of time, is that the disclosure laws have largely concentrated on financial reporting. That's because the shareholders' interests is in the financial profits at the end of the day. But we have seen a gradual change towards greater emphasis on non-financial reporting. So in a way, we've seen steps towards what we are now seeing as the new sustainable finance framework. So non-financial reporting has become important. And what that involves is looking at the non-financial risks and looking at how non-financial elements of corporate activity are then used, and the way that those non-financial elements are used and the impacts of that use of those non-financial areas is then translated. It gets measured and translated into a financial way of measuring. So we see a kind of melding together of the financial and the non-financial. Now, the Paris Agreement was obviously a major turning point for everybody, as well as the creation of the UN's Sustainable Development Goals. And the European Commission very quickly got itself involved in that whole agenda and took a leadership role. I think we can say that as a good thing about the EU's efforts, that the EU has become a leading region in developing the frameworks for us to move towards a more sustainable future. And so we've seen a number of efforts made at the European level, and the European Green Deal has been a really key part of this process. And one element of the Green Deal has been to think about the investment plan, because there is a need to mobilise at least £1 trillion or €1 trillion of sustainable investments over the next decade. And so what the Green Deal has tried to do is to create an enabling framework to facilitate and stimulate the public and private investments that are needed to pay for this transition towards a climate neutrality. And what we see in this plan is a key role being given to the financial sector, because the financial sector can perhaps reorient investments towards more sustainable technologies and businesses. And finance growth, it can also finance growth in a sustainable manner over the long term. And the idea is that it will contribute to the creation of a low carbon, climate resilient and circular economy. And so the action plan focuses very heavily on the financial sector. And it tries to give guidance for the financial actors about what economic activities can be considered as sustainable, so that they turn their investments in that direction. And so what we've got is this kind of, this is a very simplistic diagram, because actually it's a really complicated structural arrangement, what we've come up with. But at the heart of it, or if you like, at the top of it, is the taxonomy. And I'll talk about that shortly. And alongside this taxonomy, which is a kind of classification system that will identify what can be classed as sustainable activities as opposed to non-sustainable activities. So it gives to the investors some clear indication of where they might best put their money. And then alongside the taxonomy, we have the Sustainable Financial Disclosures Regulation, which is a regulation asking the financial actors to disclose their financial products that they are offering. In other words, they're saying to potential investors, this fund will be dealing with more sustainable products if you want to invest here. So it's kind of a disclosure process to help investors know where their money is going. And then the Corporate Sustainable Reporting Directive, which has just come into play, is also very important. And that is a directive asking the non-financial corporates to report on their activities to show what kinds of impacts they are actually having on the planet and on society. And then underneath that further, some changes have been made to the markets and financial disclosures, markets and financial instruments directive, where the financial actors have been given duties to think about their clients' sustainability preferences. So I don't need this slide, because this just repeats really what that diagram was all about. But the taxonomy regulation is very interesting, because it aims to help the financial actors to reorient their capital flows towards sustainable investments. And what it does is it has two main functions: to provide a common language for talking about sustainability, and to offer objective, quantifiable criteria for assessing businesses to say, is this a sustainable business activity or is it not? So it's a way of trying to prevent that greenwashing that has been a real problem for us for a very long time. It highlights 6 environmental objectives, and it goes on to explain how different activities fit within those various objectives. And it's supported by a set of technical screening criteria. And these are very detailed this is a detailed system which sets out all the different activities and goes through them to explain how they are sustainable or how they are not. And that is those technical screening criteria are developed through a series of what we call delegated acts. So we're seeing layers of regulation here. And I think it takes quite a long time to navigate this whole system. I think that's a potential problem. Then we've got the Sustainable Financial Disclosure Regulation, which is targeting the financial market actors themselves, asking them to provide detailed financial information and non-financial sustainability related information. And they have to provide information about themselves, but also about the products that they are offering for their potential investors to put their money into. And again, those are accompanied by a set of regulatory technical standards. And then we've got the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, which aims for non-financial companies to provide better information about the sustainability risks that they are exposed to, as well as their own impact on people and planet. And a key feature of this new directive is that it has a double materiality element. And that means talking about risks inside the company and risks that that company puts onto the outside. And we can talk about that later. So I need to get myself through the rest of this talk, but basically the requirements are that companies that are in scope are required to provide in their management report clearly identifiable information that covers all of the sustainability matters. I will share these slides later so that they can be circulated. And again, that directive is accompanied by a secondary level of regulatory product, which is found in the European European Sustainability Reporting Standards, and they are produced by the European Financial Reporting Advisory Group. So what we can see in this system is a whole range of primary legislation that is accompanied by secondary legislation on one or more layers. Importantly, this directive itself has really widened the number of companies that are covered. So whereas the earlier non-financial reporting directive covered roughly 11,000 companies, this new directive brings into its scope around about 50,000 companies across the European Union and beyond. In fact, it has extraterritorial effect. So as a brief critique, there are a number of strengths of this new sustainable financial plan. The strengths include that the taxonomy, I think, is a major breakthrough. It offers more precise criteria for determining what may be sustainable activities, and it may help to prevent or reduce the greenwashing and sustainability washing that has been a huge problem. The double materiality feature is, I think, a really important one because it highlights not just the risks to the company, but it also talks about the risks of the company's activities to the environment and society. And one might describe this whole setup as a smart mix of regulation because it involves mandatory as well as soft legislation, and it includes guidelines and standards. The taxonomy aims to work with scientific evidence, so it does have a scientific base, and I think that allows it to have a greater level of objectivity, perhaps. So that's potentially a good thing. And I think it does offer a degree of greater clarity over what economic activities can be seen as sustainable and what will not. But there is controversy. So one of the more recent delegated acts actually allowed gas and nuclear fuel to be seen as at least transitionally sustainable. So that led to a number of concerns about how fully effective this taxonomy will really be in practice. It's still early days. There are, I'm afraid, a number of weaknesses in this whole framework. I think the amount of complexity is problematic. It took me a long time to navigate it and to get my head around it. The taxonomy and the European sustainability reporting standards have a huge number of data points, and I'll show that up in the next couple of slides. But I think what that really means is that for companies, it's going to be a huge amount of work to gather the amount of data that they will need to disclose fully and accurately under this new regime. There's also a need to develop a greater understanding of that double materiality concept. And I think that we'll see a lot of debate around that over the next few years. As a directive, the Corporate Sustainable Reporting Directive is likely to leave room for differences because, as we all know, member states are left to implement the directive in the ways that works for them. So we may well see some differences in the requirements across the EU over time. The extraterritorial impacts, that's not necessarily a negative, but again, it could lead to some arguments by companies outside of the EU, suggesting that they're not prepared or not fully in compliance. And we're seeing across the world different taxonomies. And so, again, we might see some complexity and issues around comparability of requirements needed for companies that are acting or acting universally or that act outside and beyond the EU. And these next two slides highlight the level of complexity. So this is the European Sustainability Reporting Standards, and we've got different layers of requirement and detail in these. And again, this is another sort of diagrammatic explanation of what these standards look like. And again, we can see a whole range of different areas. And I think that for companies, it's going to be extremely difficult in their compliance departments. And I think we're going to have to see rearrangements of how companies work with their data. And I think a real issue also is that this Sustainable Finance Action Plan and the Green Deal itself is still very much a market-making neoliberal approach. We see a whole emphasis being placed on the role of the finance actors. And while finance is really important, my concern is that I see nothing in this plan that challenges the power that the financial market actors actually enjoy. And they enjoy this through a regime of accumulation, i.e., a regime of profit maximization. And I don't see anything in this plan that really questions that process. It's still a financialization. And the question I have is whether the financial market actors are going to be capable of leaving behind their quest for shareholder primacy and profit. The Green Deal made clear that the EU's preference is for this to be an enabling system. And I wonder if it's going to just be enabling those financial market actors to enjoy their power even more. Some commentators are more optimistic. They see that the ESG investors can have a positive role. That there are too many of them now with too big investments to let the planet fail. And we see among the investor community itself demands for more sustainable behaviours. The younger generations, are very aware of climate change, and they may collaborate with those investment firms to make sure that climate change is reduced. But others Other commentators are less sure. They see an exceptional growth of sustainable finance that is labelled that way, but it doesn't necessarily mean that the investments always flow towards the sustainable sectors. So we see, for example, BlackRock, yes, it puts its money into some sustainable activities, but it's still also putting its money into oil and gas and also other non-sustainable activities. So there's still also in this plan a lot of flexibility about what and how to report, and a lot of flexibility and choice about where to invest the funds. And I wonder if ultimately we'll see an imbalance in where the money is being put, so that some activities, whilst being sustainable, do not receive the funding. And that leaves me with a number of questions left unanswered. Can green capitalism escape that capitalist logic of accumulation? Is there an over-reliance on technology? And if so, will that lead to denialism about some of the negative impacts that technology might bring with it? As to risks and returns, who really does bear the risks? Double materiality is important because it looks at risks and impacts on both levels, risks to the company and risks from the company. But does that sufficiently protect all the bearers of the risks? Does transparency itself really improve behaviours, or does it just improve information? A further problem is, how can we reduce the complexity to achieve the transparency that we want? Could corporate governance structures themselves have a role to play here? Might we need to look at who are in the boardrooms of our companies? Do we need different actors in those boardrooms, people with different kinds of expertise? And what about the role of the regulators themselves? Are they sufficiently educated for the sustainability demands that are required of them? There are some possible solutions. We cannot deny the dilemma that's faced. The transition towards a climate neutral economy is going to be expensive. But I worry if we are dancing with the devil by focusing so strongly on those financial actors. I think we should also be considering much more strongly the debate around growth and degrowth. I still haven't made up my mind about that. Degrowth, I kind of like the idea of some of the suggestions being made there, but I wonder if that's really fully possible given the political climate that we all live in. Should we interrogate more fully what we mean by wealth and abundance? What actually should we be valuing? And who should benefit from what we value? Should we identify those products that are without value or that have a negative value, perhaps, and prohibit their manufacture and sale altogether? There's still a need, I think, to challenge the shareholder primacy principle that pervades this space. And perhaps we need to be thinking more fully, more strongly, more imaginatively about the ownership designs of our corporations. And perhaps we should be thinking about a different approach to management. Should we be looking more at a servant leadership management style rather than one that is just chasing the corporate profits? We need a more democratic approach that involves those affected communities, as well as different generations and the scientists, and not just relying on the market experts in this area. What I see in the whole development of this regulatory arena is that the financial market actors themselves claim a large amount of expertise. So the platform for sustainable finance involves the majority of the members on that platform are financial market actors. There are very few of the scientific experts or stakeholders really being given a full voice in that platform, as far as I can see. Should we impose enforceable duties on the financial market actors? And if so, what duties would they be? And I think we mustn't forget that states and regulators still have an important role to play here. So to conclude, there is a role for private market actors. We can't deny that. We need the money to help us reach a non-sustainable economy, and we need that sustainable. We need us to transition towards a sustainable economy, and that will cost. I think the concern I have is that the financial actors, they may want to put in the funds, but they will expect returns back. And I'm not sure that we can have our cake and eat it. A further risk here is of a rebound around, when we embark on new technologies that claim to be more sustainable, we may find that there's a rebound effect. Take, for example, the development of electric vehicles. They are not without environmental harms either. Calling on the market actors should not push states and communities out of the frame. And I wonder if we should adopt a more commanding, more compelling regulatory system rather than one that is just nudging. And the regulators need further education on sustainability science and how that connects with law and regulation. And finally, I think we do need to think more deeply about what we mean by wealth and abundance, for all or for a few. And this connects also to the growing tension between growth and degrowth, which is a developing debate.